Bonjour à tous. Hello everyone. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui pour introduire cette séance intitulée « Limiter nos impacts négatifs, les progrès ambitieux de la séquestration carbone ». Comme vous et comme bien des États dans le monde, nous travaillons sur plusieurs fronts pour lutter contre les changements climatiques et décarboner notre économie. Le Québec s'est fixé une cible de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de 37,5 % à l'horizon 2030. Nous avons aussi un objectif de réduire notre consommation de pétrole de 40 % à l'horizon 2030. Nos objectifs sont très ambitieux. Nous visons d'atteindre la carboneutralité à l'horizon 2050, d'où l'importance pour nous de travailler sur des nouvelles technologies comme la séquestration carbone. Nous souhaitons d'ailleurs à favoriser notre indépendance énergétique au Québec. Parmi les leviers mis en place par le gouvernement du Québec pour réaliser ces cibles, rappelons l'adoption en avril dernier de la loi visant principalement à mettre fin à la recherche et la production d'hydrocarbures ainsi qu'au financement public de ces activités. Pour nous, l'avenir est aux énergies vertes, pas aux énergies fossiles. C'est grâce à cette nouvelle loi, c'est pour ça que je vous en parle, et en s'inspirant des pays qui ont fait preuve de l'audace en la matière, que des projets pilotes de séquestration de CO2, de stockage d'hydrogène vert et de géothermie pourront voir le jour et nous donner la possibilité de caractériser le potentiel des réservoirs géologiques québécois. Ces projets nous permettront d'acquérir les connaissances nécessaires au développement des filières et d'élaborer le cadre réglementaire nécessaire au déploiement approprié de ces filières pour le bénéfice de la transition énergétique du Québec. Parmi les stratégies du gouvernement du Québec pour l'atteinte des cibles, il y a notamment la mise en place du plan directeur en transition, innovation et efficacité énergétique. Ce plan directeur a été prolongé tout récemment jusqu'à l'horizon 2026. Ce plan directeur vise essentiellement à structurer, optimiser la consommation énergétique. Des investissements majeurs sont donc consentis pour plus de 200 mesures afin d'accélérer la transition énergétique. C'est plus de 12 milliards de dollars qui vont être investis dans le plan de transition énergétique. Parmi les éléments clés du plan directeur, on retrouve notamment une nouvelle stratégie québécoise sur l'hydrogène vert et les bioénergies qui a été annoncée tout récemment à l'Association québécoise de production d'énergie renouvelable par mon ministre, le ministre Julien. Nous visons aussi la sobriété et l'efficacité énergétique et bien sûr le développement des énergies renouvelables, tout cela en visant une transition juste et équitable pour la société québécoise. Dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de ce plan directeur en transition énergétique, le gouvernement du Québec encourage les projets pilotes innovants, représentant des perspectives intéressantes en matière d'économie et d'environnement. Les deux vont de pair pour nous. Sont donc mis à l'avant la séquestration du carbone, ainsi que la récupération de valorisation de rejets thermiques. Plusieurs projets sont d'ailleurs en développement au Québec. Citons entre autres celui de CarbiCrete, une entreprise québécoise ici présente sur ce panel, qui a eu droit à un financement du programme Technoclimat chez nous et qui a développé une technologie qui permet de produire un béton sans ciment et à empreinte carbone négative avec des sous-produits industriels et du CO2 capté. Les ambitions du Québec sont grandes. Nous avons la chance d'avoir un grand potentiel avec nos ressources naturelles. Le Québec est devenu le tout premier État en Amérique du Nord à révoquer les licences visant la recherche et la production d'hydrocarbures sur son territoire. Rappelons que le Québec fait partie, depuis le 4 novembre 2021, d'une coalition d'États qui sont engagés dans la même démarche, le Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, aussi nommé BOGA. Nous souhaitons travailler avec les États qui ont tout autant d'ambition, en concertation avec les acteurs d'ici et d'ailleurs. La captation et la séquestration du carbone s'avèrent être une solution qui suscite plus d'intérêt que jamais. Elle est essentielle à l'atteinte de nos objectifs ambitieux. Pour vous entretenir sur les progrès ambitieux de la captation carbone, je laisse la parole à M. Chris Stern, directeur général de CarbiCrete, Mme Nicole Hurtubise, directrice générale d'Arbres Canada, Mme Natalie Kian, chef de division États-Unis, qui est en virtuel, et à M. Pierre Graff, directeur général du Regroupement des jeunes chambres de commerce du Québec, pour animer la séance. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Je vous souhaite une excellente conférence.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis ravi que vous soyez avec nous. Ravi également de renouveler l'expérience du regroupement avec le FEIA, qui est un partenaire extraordinaire. D'ailleurs, je pense que vous le voyez avec la qualité de l'événement, une nouvelle fois en présentiel, extraordinaire, auquel on assiste. Pour la suite, je continuerai toutefois en anglais avec Natalie qui est avec nous en ligne, Nicole et Chris, et avec évidemment une mise en contexte. So, just to put things in perspective, last year we produced globally 34.6 billion tons of CO2. And I have one good news and one bad news. Good news is half of it has been captured by natural ecosystems, such as trees, oceans, etc. The pretty bad news right now is that only 0.1% of those emissions have been captured by innovative companies. So you see that we are facing a huge challenge right now to address climate change and emissions. For instance, in Canada, we developed a couple of years before Project Quest in Alberta. And it was initiated by Shell Company, and they invested as much as 1.3 billion Canadian dollars. And it allows them today to capture around 1 million tons of CO2. You remember that I said it was 34 billion tons that we have to capture every year to make sure that we are zero emission. So you see that there's a huge gap that we have to face right now. And of course, to put in perspective, all other things being equal, it would cost more than 1/3 of our global GDP to reach zero emission with the actual technology that we have. So, and I'll give you a last example, because forests can do the job, but we don't have enough space across Earth to make sure that we don't have any emissions, because we need between 1 and 5 square kilometers of forest, depending on the type of forest that we have, to capture 1 million tons of CO2. So the only question is, will we be able to scale the technologies that we have fast enough to fight and beat climate change? To answer this question, we have Chris, Natalie, and Nicole with us, and I would like to start with a simple question, because I see some faces in the room, and I'm pretty sure that you don't know that there is a huge difference between carbon sequestration, carbon utilization, and carbon capture, which are pretty different things. So Natalie, you'll be the first to speak today. Thank you very much for being with us. You're in the US right now. Could you walk us through those differences?
Yes, I'm actually in Canada.
Oh, you're in Canada right now. Okay. Oh, yeah. That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go Canada.
Yeah. And go Canada. I just wanted to say briefly, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for including us in this conversation. I represent Climeworks, not Climeworks. There's another amazing organization called Climeworks, so just want to be clear about that. Yeah, when you think about carbon, it's kind of complicated. We have our natural carbon cycle that includes trees, and as you said, Pierre, unfortunately, it's not going to be quite enough, as we have stepped outside of that natural carbon cycle to include burning of fossil fuels. Even if we increase the capacity of the natural carbon biome to absorb CO2, which we need to do desperately, even if we do that, it won't be quite enough to make up for that additional CO2 that we've added through the burning of fossil fuels. So the most important thing that any company or country or individual can do is reducing your footprint. So that would be making sure that we're emitting as little as possible. And that could be transitioning to electrification, responsible electrification, or materials that use less carbon. Then you have carbon avoidance. So that is actually avoiding emitting a ton of CO2. And that's what you hear about often when you hear about carbon credits. So that is, you emit a ton of carbon and then you pay someone somewhere else not to emit a ton of carbon. Carbon removals are actually removing that ton of carbon. So if you think of our overall carbon budget as a bathtub, every time you put in a drop of water, you need to actually remove that drop of water if we're going to get to net zero. So those three categories, carbon reduction, carbon avoidance, and carbon removal, are the framework for this whole conversation and how we have to think about carbon moving forward.
Perfect. So when we talk about carbon removal, and we're going to focus today on the three ways of doing it. Chris, would you tell us more about the difference between those three, carbon sequestration, carbon utilization, and carbon capture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, carbon capture is, what Climeworks does and what others do, carbon engineering, and Svante, companies like this, where, you can either capture it at the source, so on top of a flue gas, the Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan, for example, that's flue gas capture. Then you've got direct air capture, like Climeworks. So that's the carbon capture part. Carbon sequestration is when you put it into the ground and hopefully it doesn't leak out. And that's what they're doing at Boundary Dam, as well in Saskatchewan. Then you get to the point where, obviously don't produce more carbon. So like Natalie said, let's try and, cut it down. But we're humans and we've got this far. So let's not only do that, but we've also got to avoid carbon. So in the case of what we do at CarbiCrete, we don't use cement, which is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. When they make cement, there's CO2 that's released from burning as well as the actual chemical reaction. So we don't use cement. So we've eliminated that source of carbon. And that's what carbon abatement is. That's what I'm just riffing off what Natalie said. And then finally, you've got carbon utilization or carbon removal, which is the frontier credits that people talk about, and which is what we need to vastly improve upon. And that's when you take carbon dioxide that's been previously captured either at the flue gas source or direct air captured, and you put it into something, a product like concrete. So we abate carbon dioxide by not using cement, and we also put CO2 into the concrete, creating calcium carbonate, which will never ever leak into the atmosphere again. So those are the differences.
Nicole, do you want to add something about that?
Yes, thank you. And thanks very much to both Natalie and Chris. Really interesting. What I want to look at sequestration from a nature-based solution. So at Tree Canada, we talk about sequestration. And essentially, as we know, CO2 is, as mentioned a few minutes ago, is stored in soils, peat bogs, in forests, oceans, plants. And essentially, if we go back to our grade 4 science class, it's all about photosynthesis and how the natural environment captures CO2 and produces oxygen. And so trees are a natural carbon sink for CO2, as are oceans. Trees are able to capture carbon over their lifetime, more or less 80 years. So you could look at about 3 to 5 trees, depending on the environment, the climate, the species, who will capture 1 ton of carbon over the lifetime. And that's what we're focusing on at Tree Canada in terms of how trees are part of the solution around CO2. We are not the solution, but complementing other innovative possibilities. We're part of the solution.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to go back to Natalie right now because I really want to understand the technology behind Climeworks. Can you walk us through it and tell us about when did you decided, when Climeworks decided to create this company, and what was the challenges to build the technology and the R&D and everything?
Absolutely, yeah. So Climeworks has been around for about 12 years. We are what's called a direct air capture company, and that means that we pull CO2 out of the air and then store it permanently as rock underground. So basically, if you think about it from a feedstock perspective, our feedstock is ambient air. Climeworks was started by 2 guys out of ETH, Zurich, as a research project, and then they realized that they could turn it into a real technology that captured CO2 We have, over the years, had about 16 different facilities, but our largest facility and the first ever commercial direct air capture facility was launched just under a year ago, last September, in Iceland. It's called Orca, and it captures 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. So that is, in terms of the overall problem, quite small, but is the first of its kind facility, and it's the first step forward. We are in the process of building our next facility, which will be 10x the size, and then are planning the following facility after that, which is likely to be in North America, which will be 10x the size of that. So that will be about 400,000 tons. Our goal is really to accelerate the scale up because we need to be at essentially the size of the automotive industry by the mid 2030s if we're going to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees. So to take this back a little bit, for us to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees, we need to remove between 500 to 1,000 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere before the end of the century. And that's if we hit our net zero targets. So that's if we hit all of our reduction goals as a society. Scaling up nature-based solutions like planting trees and soil carbon and biochar and all those good things are a necessary part of that. But at maximum scale, they won't be quite enough. So there's still going to be a deficit there that needs to be taken up by engineered removal solutions. The reason for that is, like I said before, we've been burning fossil fuels for a long time. And when you burn fossil fuels, you're adding extra carbon to the carbon cycle that the trees and plants can't take up. So the way that our technology works is we basically have big boxes with fans. The fans blow air across a sorbent material. That sorbent material absorbs the CO2. We then enter a desorption phase where we heat the box up with steam, and then we can vacuum out a pure CO2 gas from that. You can do lots of different things with that CO2 gas. So you could use it for a process like what CarbiCrete does. You could use it for power to liquids, PTX, to create sustainable aviation fuel. You could put it in a Coca-Cola. But what we've decided to do with it, at first at least, is to store it permanently as rock underground. So we work with a company called CarbFix that injects that CO2 in the form of bubbly water into basalt rock. And there it turns into a carbonate. So it turns into rock and is stored permanently.
And can you tell us, Natalie, please, more about the competitions? Do you have many competitors? Do you know how many companies wants to develop the same thing? And what are the biggest challenges for you to scale up fast enough to fight climate change?
Absolutely. So there are a few other companies in the space. The largest other direct air capture company is called Carbon Engineering. They are also based in BC. They have a slightly different method than us. They use a liquid sorbent for their method. There are a bunch of other CDR technologies out there, carbon dioxide removal technologies. Most of them are at the lab stage or just beyond that. So other than Carbon Engineering, we're kind of the only ones who are in the process of scaling. Yeah, so there may be a couple other techniques that come to the forefront, but it seems like direct air capture is probably going to be the technique that scales the most. The biggest challenge that we're facing, I think, is an understanding overall in society that to date, we really haven't paid the true cost of goods because we haven't paid for the CO2 emissions that are caused by everything that we're using. So we really need to start thinking about our carbon in the same way that we think about water treatment or trash collection. And I think, if governments started treating it that way, then we would really be able to scale quite quickly. But for the time being, the voluntary market is a great place to start. But I think that policy and generally an understanding that this is like a problem of the commons that needs to be handled in that way is the biggest challenge.
We're going to be able to focus on the solutions, and I'm pretty sure that because I might talk about one or two solutions that I was thinking of, and it could be pretty. You could benefit from it, but we're going to go there later. Chris, can you tell us more about the technology behind CarbiCrete and the history of the company? Because you're an entrepreneur, you took the risk of creating CarbiCrete and the technology behind that. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Pierre. It's actually my second startup. My first startup was in solar power. And interestingly enough, the whole carbon dioxide removal market, carbon tech, is kind of following what solar did back in the day. So, I got involved in the solar power industry in 2005. It was 1.8 gigawatts. Now it's about 100 gigawatts. After 17 years. So it's not following Moore's law, but it's following something like Moore's law. So after we sold that company in 2014, looking around for things to do, I was introduced to the folks at McGill, who first of all educated me, that told me that first of all, this beautiful white material called cement is actually bad. The production of cement produces about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. We use about 30 gigatons of concrete every year. China, for example, makes 2,000. They make enough concrete to build 2,000 Pentagons, the U.S. military building. So you can see like the hugeness of it, and it's not going away. So the manufacturing of cement, which is a key ingredient to concrete, is you take limestone, you put it in a kiln, use fossil fuels or old tires or whatever you can to burn the limestone and create clinker. So you could take away the fossil fuels and do it with electrification, but the whole concept of tearing off the CO2 from the calcium carbonate still produces CO2. So you either have to capture it or use a different material. So at McGill, they determined that you could use something called steel slag, which is an industrial waste byproduct of the steelmaking process. There's 250 million tons of it used or produced every year. And this product, which it looks like a mineral, like a rock, it's generally not usable in anything except for road base or like basically inexpensive aggregates. So the researchers at McGill determined that if you grind this up, mix it with sand and water, make it into products, and subject it to CO2, you're actually reversing the process and you're making calcium carbonate. So get rid of cement, get rid of steel slag, which is a nuisance, and we permanently remove CO2. And so that's at the founding of CarbiCrete, that was back in 2016, we said, hey, this is a great idea. Why don't we commercialize this? And so, we started the team, myself and the inventor, and then added quickly 2 more. We're at 30 people now, with 1,000 square meters in Lachine. We're running our second phase of pilot is starting up in October of this year in La Belle Province, in Drummondville at Patio Drummond. And after that will be a commercialized operation in December. And so that's basically the history of CarbiCrete, and it's better than I ever expected, because if you look at the example of what we actually, our first product is a concrete block. What is a concrete block? It's the things that build walls, in hospitals, in arenas and things like this. They weigh about 18 kilograms. By not using cement, we abate 2 kilograms of CO2 in that concrete block, and we can actually utilize and permanently capture within the concrete up to 1 kilogram of CO2 per block. So using this technology, going forward with the amount of steel slag being available and the CO2, we can actually abate and remove about 200 million tons of CO2. So much to the point of what you said before, it's all hands on deck. We're not the only solution in concrete, and concrete is not the only thing to look at. So, basically, we need to attack it from all angles.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there's a bit of hope. That's good news. But I want to see with Nicole right now, because like I said in the introduction, nature has been doing its job for like millions of years. We had oceans and forests. They were the planet Earth lungs, and they were pretty much doing the job. But right now we have an issue because we produce so much emissions that we cannot deal with it anymore. So can you talk to us about what Tree Canada does and how trees are important and part of the solution right now?
Yeah, thanks very much. Absolutely. And so Tree Canada is a nonprofit. It's a charitable organization, and it's been in existence for 30 years. And over those 30 years, we have worked with companies, we've worked with municipalities, with civil society, with local groups to plant trees in the right place, the right species across Canada. And over those 30 years, we've planted 84 million trees. To come back to your question, nature knows what it has to do. Forests and oceans have always done their job really, really well. But with the imbalance right now, it's very difficult for nature to actually regulate climate. Forests capture different amounts of carbon at different speeds, depending on the average of the tree, depending on the forest itself, depending on the growing conditions. Young trees have a whole life ahead of them to capture, to sequester carbon, and the older trees sequester carbon both in soil and in their in the wood. At Tree Canada, we really focus on preserving current forests, on reforesting degraded areas, so areas that have been hit by wildfires or that are degraded for other reasons, and on just increasing forest cover across the country, both rural and urban. Last year, through the support of sponsors and other funders, we were able to plant 800,000 trees, which my director of communications is about to give me the two fingers right now. Is saying, just tell them that represents 200,000 tons of carbon being captured throughout the atmosphere. Over the next 10 years, we're looking at planting 20 million trees thanks to funding that we've been able to secure. And that in itself will contribute to capturing carbon. I think it's really important to also remember that trees and forests are not only about carbon capture, right? Trees or forests are absolutely essential to our well-being as a society, to habitat protection, to biodiversity, to protecting soil from erosion. And so for Tree Canada, it's really protecting the integrity of the forest as well. In terms of the work that we do, I'd just like to focus on urban forestry for a minute. We work with municipalities and partners to look at how can we green cities. By 2050, we know that 2/3 of the population on the planet will be living in urban centers, 2/3. And we also know that cities right now are warmer generally than surrounding areas. So as climate change increases, cities will become hotter and warmer. And so we need to focus on how do we green cities with green roofs, with more permeable soils, with ponds, with trees, but that's some of the work that we're doing with municipalities and with other partners. We are also working very closely with our corporate partners and companies who are coming to us and saying, look, we want to reduce our CO2 emissions. How can you help us do that? Because we understand that that trees and forests are part of the solution. So we have a number of corporate partners with whom we help develop CO2 reduction goals and who help us plant trees across the country. This is good for, obviously, for the environment, but it's also good in terms of CSR, in terms of workforce engagement, in terms of environmental responsibility. So and national greening across the country, so planting trees in rural areas with support of partners. And one last thing that I'd like to add is that the survivability of trees is really important to Tree Canada. So you can plant a tree, turn around, that tree will die. But we work with partners across the country to look at 1 year, 2 year, 5 year survivability assessments. And if they don't survive, we replant them. And then over the years, we work with partners to ensure that those trees are nurtured.
Yeah, and I have a couple of questions for you, because you said that you've planted 84 million trees. Do you know how many million tons of CO2 it does remove from the air every year?
I hope someone has a calculator.
Do you have an estimate or something?
No.
Just to,
I don't have that offset, no.
Because the offset might be pretty interesting. But do you know if there's any country who has the same kind of nonprofit doing the same job that you do?
There are in the United States, for example, we work closely with the Arbor Day Foundation, who does tree planting and community work across the country. And tree planting is not only in northern countries, right? We see it in southern countries where countries are fighting against deforestation and just droughts. So I think we're seeing a movement across the world to really focus on trees as essential not only to carbon capture and sequestration, but also to help us deal with protecting biodiversity and just the overall impacts of climate change.
And we've also heard about deforestation, that private companies sometimes say that they plant trees when they after they cut them down to create new forest. Is it mandatory to plant the same species, or they can plant any tree and it works as efficiently as it was working before?
Yeah, we have arborists and experts across the country, and that is a question that we pose to them. Ideally, what we want to do, well, not ideally, what we want to do is protect the integrity of the forests and the biosystems and the biodiversity and the habitat. So trees are planted in a certain area to match the growing conditions, and you don't want to plant commercial trees that will grow fast but that do not protect the rest of the forest.
Okay, perfect. And in order to increase carbon capture, sequestration, utilization, innovation, we saw that Elon Musk, the man himself, created a $100 million prize for the most innovative company. And could you tell us what, according to you, drives best innovation, Natalie? Do you think, what are the main things that can drive innovation when it comes to carbon capture?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of mechanisms right now in the market for funding research and development, like the X Prize, which is great. What we're lacking is a large-scale mechanism to fund the scale-up. So when you look at the voluntary market, there are a lot of companies who are really leading the way by purchasing carbon removals to abate their unavoidable emissions, their footprint, and reach a net zero goal. And that's fantastic. But we can't rely on corporations or companies to do that. We really need government funding and mechanisms to kind of reach the scale up. So, I mean, the best and easiest way to do this would be basically for the government to say, we will buy an unlimited amount of carbon dioxide removals that hit these quality parameters at this price starting, and then a scale down in price over time. And what that would do is it would allow kind of unlimited innovation and development, and would unlock private equity money, project financing. It would allow bank lending essentially, and low debt financing to really build these large scale infrastructure sized projects that are needed to attack this problem. So R&D is great, and there are some really good mechanisms out there for funding that, and even for purchasing kind of the first offtake and first credits that are produced by these nascent projects. But we don't yet have a mechanism to fill that gap for the scale up and for the ultimate full scale of the problem.
So do you think that companies that produce a lot of emissions should be forced to buy a technology like yours to make sure that they offset the emissions that they create?
Personally, yeah, I mean, personally, yes. I think that Climeworks would take a slightly more nuanced perspective on that. Like, a carbon tax is one way to do it, right? A carbon tax is one way to structure it. A cap and trade program is another. Ultimately, it is a problem of the commons, though. So it's going to be paid by people, whether it's through the cost of goods or through taxation. And I think if we can keep it as simple as possible and not have to be like monitoring companies, like companies should be required to reduce their emissions, and we should really try to move away from high emissions sectors, which is something that like CarbiCrete is doing. But also, I think that governments need to fund this.
So I told you that my solution would be nice to you, but the thing is that those a carbon tax should be invested in private equity or venture capital for innovative companies fighting climate change. Is it a solution, Chris?
Yeah, it's a possible solution. I mean, the Green Fund in Quebec was funded that way. I think we could do that within Canada as well as globally. But certainly a carbon tax is the easiest thing to explain to somebody. You know, you got to pay for what you've polluted, right? It's simple as that. You know, that's one source. And then the other thing, just to further on what Natalie said, I mean, you know, you've got CCUS tax credits, investment tax credits, which is like the solar investment tax credit that saw the solar industry grow like parabolically in the United States. Because you had companies like Google and these that were trying to like eat up some tax appetite. And so in order to do that, they invested in solar projects. We could do the same thing in carbon removal projects. You could also have, as I said, the governments do investments into CCUS. Canadian government's doing this right now. It's not big enough, but you know, it's a start. You know, and obviously hopefully the United States has to follow suit because, you know, we're in bed with an elephant, and it's just whatever we want to do here should be mirrored there or vice versa, because the borders are, you know, CO2 doesn't have a border, basically.
Yeah. Can I add something quickly to that?
Yeah, of course.
So I think when you think about, again, going back to the avoidance and reduction piece versus the removal piece, the policies that accelerate those two things differently kind of have to be separated. So government regulation can really help with avoidance and reduction because you can mandate things like carbon capture at the point source. But we also need to fund the removals piece. And that, I think, is where large-scale government procurement could be incredibly helpful. So those, I just want to make the distinction between kind of the two different parts of carbon accounting and how government can help fund those two different paths.
Yeah. Do you think, Nicole, that there's any other way the government should act to fight climate change? Do you think that there are other solutions?
I think well, two thoughts. So just on the question of innovation, if I may, and I'm certainly not an expert in innovation in the private sector, I won't speak on that, leave that to my colleagues. But in terms of innovation with regards to nature-based solutions, that can come from many different sectors as well. And Tree Canada developed a partnership with the First Nations community in BC and launched an initiative called the Great Bear Initiative. And the idea here is to protect old growth forests from being deforested. And companies are able to offset some of their CO2s based on really strict guidelines and regulatory restrictions. And so that's a very innovative way to consider nature-based solution. In terms of government, the Canadian government has launched an initiative to have 2 billion trees planted by 2050. And so the funding is made available to various to civil society and other groups across Canada. And so I think that type of initiative where you actually are able to create a policy framework and to push groups to, certainly in our case, to reforest and to afforest, that is, I think that's very important. And for that particular project, we're one of the key partners, and we're very proud to be able to do that.
Okay, and do you think the zero emission in 2050 is a real and attainable goal that government fixed at the COP22?
You're in the hot seat.
Yeah. So so I have two answers. One of them is we can't fail. right? That we can't, if we want a livable planet, if we want a livable climate, we can't afford to fail. If we want to be able to look at our grandchildren in the face and say, actually, this is what we're leaving behind, then zero net has to happen by 2050, and that is everybody's job together through these innovative initiatives we're talking about, through nature-based solutions everywhere in the world. So part of me says, well, we can't fail.
Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why we're doing it for our kids and grandkids, right? You can't look them in the eye and say, we're leaving you this mess, right? It's like, imagine you worked for Philip J. Morris and say, I make cigarettes. You know, it's the same thing, right? You have to get away from that and work on it, right? If we don't do something now, it's just going to be, like Nicole said, we can't fail, right? So we need all these things. It's all hands on deck.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something that Natalie said, because I had pretty much the same idea, and I was thinking in my head, in French, of course, so sorry about what I'm going to say. It's going to be pretty weird, I think. But do you think that we can put a price on CO2 emissions and add it to the financial statement or the financial statements of the company and see if there's still a profit at the end of the year? Because I think that it's completely wrong to do business and to not understand that what we do is not profitable when we add the environmental cost of what we're doing. So Natalie, if you did understand my question, which was absolutely not correct in English, you can answer.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Like, ultimately, like from an economics perspective, if we take the predictions about climate change seriously, it economically makes sense to redirect our entire economy towards fighting climate change. So yeah, like if you were to apply a true cost of carbon to things, I think you would see some scary numbers there. And I think it's really hard to set a cost of carbon. This is a whole nother topic that we can dig into. But ultimately, the cost of carbon will be the price of removing carbon multiplied by the number of tons needed from each method. So basically, we're not going to be able to preset that price until we have these methods scaled up. And it is, like Nicole and Chris were saying, it's not an option. And it's a really tough challenge because we've never undergone an energy transition from a higher density fuel source like fossil fuels to a lower density one like electricity. So we're going to really have to innovate in the energy sector as well as in the carbon abatement sector.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to add something?
Yeah, look, you know, it's, yeah, I'm at a loss. You know, it's something that we honestly just can't fail at, you know, and it's like much to what Natalie is saying, you know, it's hard to put a price on carbon. You know, it could be $1,200 to suck it out of the air and stick it into basaltic rock in Iceland, you know. It could be $100 a ton to put into concrete. We don't know because we're just getting these technologies done right now and started right now. But the point is they have to be supported now so that we can get to that point. That's your original question.
Yeah, but the thing is that it was a trick question, by the way. Oh. Because, like I said in introduction, I said that we produce a year 34 billion tons of carbon, right? Trees and oceans, get rid of half of it. So we have 18 billion tons of CO2 right now to deal with. Since we know that it would cost around a third of the global GDP, you can do the math and see how much a million ton of carbon or a ton of carbon costs. So right now we could have a way to see the real price of doing business and creating emissions, and you could see if there's still a profit at the end. So do you think it could be an efficient way to at least make sure that companies understand that what they're doing is not the right thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're talking about is a global price on carbon.
Yeah.
And basically, there's discussions amongst that, but then you have to get, 200 countries to agree. Then you have to figure out what is the border tax, because some countries are less good than others. So that all has to be decided upon, and now's a pretty darn good time to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah, the SEC is starting to require carbon reporting filings. There's some rules around that have been proposed. And one of those rules actually requires the reporting of an internal carbon price. So a lot of companies are actually setting an internal carbon price right now, just for their own future risk assessment, understanding that this is the way that things might go. And it'll be interesting to see, if those rules are actually upheld and what prices companies are using.
Okay.
So yeah,
Perfect.
it's happening, but I'm not sure that it's happening in a unified way globally.
It's being driven by corporations, right? Like, it's not even governments, and that's the problem. So,
Yeah, exactly.
you have companies like Shopify, Microsoft, and Stripe, and all these others that are saying, okay, well, we're going to pay for these carbon removal carbon offset removal credits, and others are joining. There's a new frontier fund that's almost $1 billion that's going to be buying carbon offset credits. But it's companies, and this is kind of only 1%, right? So you need to have everybody agree, all countries agree on a price and factor that in.
Yeah. It's a very technical topic when it comes to sequestration, utilization, and carbon capture. And someone's going to be angry, I think, because we cannot take questions from the audience right now with a mic. But if you have a question, can you just raise your hand and maybe say it loud and clear, and I'll be able to repeat it to Natalie so she can hear it in BC. Do you have any questions? I think you were pretty good and clear because I don't have any. So no questions. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you with us. We're gonna stand here maybe 5 minutes if you want to talk to us, Natalie. It was a pleasure having you online.
Thank you.
With us. Et je voudrais remercier une dernière fois vraiment le Forum économique international des Amériques pour le travail extraordinaire qu'ils font, la place qu'ils font à la jeunesse, mais aussi les sujets qu'ils traitent, qui sont des sujets malheureusement pour lesquels on n'entend pas assez de solutions et parfois pour lesquels malheureusement on n'a pas assez d'action. J'espère que vous avez apprécié cet échange. Je vous remercie énormément. Et comme je l'ai dit, on sera là quelques minutes si jamais vous avez des questions. Merci à toutes et à tous.